Hi, it's Benjamin Taylor here again for Red Quadrant, and I'm really thrilled to be talking to Simon Higgins, one of those rare and valuable people who've got real deep experience of being involved in LGR and going right through vesting day and carrying on in the new organisation. Simon, thank you for joining us. Do you want to kick off by explaining that? What do you do? What was your role specifically in the Cumbria reorganisation? And what did that experience show you about, how LGR really works?
Yeah, thanks, Benjamin. So, hello everyone. Simon Higgins. So, I was part of the senior team that delivered LGR in Cumbria with specific responsibility for the customer and digital work stream and interdependencies with ICT, etc. And also working as part of the day one board and with the chief execs group across the wider sort of portfolio of LGR in Cumbria. Following the successful delivery of LGR in Cumbria, I went on to be Director of Resources with one of the new authorities, Cumberland Council. So that gave me a real insight into the establishment of a new organisation post LGR. And I'm sure we'll touch on this later in the conversation, but some of the things, knowing what I knew as a Director of Resources in a new organisation that I maybe would have done differently, or we would have done differently
Yeah.
as part of the LGR process. Currently supporting wider Gloucestershire in terms of their LGR process as a strategic advisor. So I've got some insight into that LGR process, early days, but bringing some of that learning into there and also learning from them in terms of how they're addressing the LGR process. So yeah, quite a lot of LGR stuff on my CV at the moment.
So, I mean, people think of customer and digital as an intensely practical role, and of course it is, but it's also one that draws quite a lot on leadership and ought to be really involved in shaping the whole structure, organisation of new councils. I hope. Let me focus on that leadership thing first. We've been talking to a lot of people about this and thinking a lot about this. How badly does LGR stretch leadership capacity? Where did the work pressure become most visible?
Well, I think it's huge. I mean, I've been involved in transformation for large parts of my career, but I've never experienced anything as big or as complex, and to be fair, as emotionally draining as LGR. So you've not just got the technical sort of aspects of delivering a huge change, establishing new organisations, bringing cultures together. You've got the emotional impact of, for us, it was 7 organisations coming to an end. In terms of my work stream and the wider work streams, we had people who'd started their careers in those authorities. They might have met their partner in those authorities. They might have had children. They've had big life experience in those authorities, and those authorities then came to an end. So you're not just managing the sort of usual technical aspects and the communication and the emotions of a normal transformation program. It's heightened to a greater extent because you've got all of that LGR stuff and that organisations coming to an end as part of it. And then equally, in local authorities, members have real ambition in terms of what they want to leave behind for their organisation. What are the key things we want to say that we delivered before our organisation comes to an end? So it's managing that and that pressure. And you've got obviously you've got the day job to do as well. So it's how you manage those sort of 3 competing priorities. Certainly for me, I think we all underestimated the impact of LGR and just how much time that would take as workstream leads and as senior leaders in those organizations. And it became really quite sort of stressful, and we had to bring in additional resource, but also we also had to manage those other pressures and try and help members get to a space where there were 2 or 3 key things they wanted to deliver rather than 10 and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I mean, I would say to anyone going through LGR, it is hugely resource and emotionally intensive,
Mm.
and really think early about the resource that you're going to need, especially in the current climate. When we were doing it, there was us and maybe one other going through it at the same time. So there was resource available out there. At this point in time, there are so many people going through it that resource is quite scarce. So getting the right resource that you can trust to support the process early on, I think, is really important.
What worries me is I think there's going to be a realization both by central government in terms of funding and by local government in terms of that capability capacity out there in the market or in people that will cause a big crunch. So I suppose getting ahead of that is a really important part of the crunch. But internally for the organisation, just have you got any tips to prevent the strongest people being swallowed by the program and business as usual suffering as a result?
I think you just got to be honest. I think everyone's got to be honest with themselves. I mean, I've done a couple of sort of through Solace. They've asked me to do a couple of talks to senior leadership teams about my experiences, and I think the one thing I would say to all of them is like, be honest with yourself. What can you deliver? What can't you deliver? What are the priorities? How are you going to make sure that you can balance all of those things, and don't think that you're superhuman and you can do everything. I mean, I think we thought we could just take on LGR as just an extra thing to do, and the volume of the work is just just so much that it's just not possible. So, I would say have a really clear plan in terms of what you can do for the day job, what you can do for the legacy, what you can do for LGR. Make sure that you've got the right resource in the right place. In terms of that leadership in LGR, I think the whole program just needs to think carefully about who it puts in all of the different places. You obviously probably want your strongest people running LGR because it's the biggest thing, but equally you don't want to take your eye off the day job. So I think there's a whole portfolio strategic overview of the resources you've got and how that matches against the things that you need to do, that the day one board or the portfolio board or the executive board or whatever each individual program calls it has a real clear overview of how that resource is deployed.
Right. I guess one other thing that you touched on in the earlier answer was the importance and the impacts on organizational culture. What did you learn in going through LGR about organizational culture? What would you do differently now? Are there tensions, behaviors that are predictable? Are there things that should have started earlier? Are there things that chief execs and political leaders can do before structures and appointments start to sort of harden into place?
I think the first thing I would say is accepting, and I'm saying this with hindsight because I'm not sure that I did or we did as much as we should have, that there are 7 different cultures, almost starting like that understanding that you do need to think about that. And
Yeah.
I think the thing I would say to chief execs and leaders and anyone in like a leadership role in the program is take some time to understand those cultures and how they are different, because even the assumption that a county council culture is one thing, a district culture is another, a borough, like it's not true. Districts are different to districts,
Yeah.
counties are different to counties. So
Right.
understanding all of those cultures, I think, and taking the time to do that is really important. I think the other thing I would say is once you start to understand, like start to prepare your teams for what is coming next. And the reason that I say that is when I moved into the role of director of resources, one of my responsibilities, just as an example, was the assets team. Lots of the people in my assets team came from districts and boroughs. And they really struggled early on with the difference between working for an organisation of 250 people, where you might have a job that looked after 4 different areas, so was quite wide and quite varied. You're then moving into an organisation of 4,000 plus people. Your job is quite, for want of a better word, strategic, but quite narrow but deep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some of the people in my team, I had quite a lot of conversations with around. They felt that had given them less responsibility, less authority, didn't give them the variety that they really enjoyed. They were used to being in an organisation where they knew everyone's name. They were used to being in an organisation where they saw the chief exec every day, if not every day, every week, just walking through the building. They could have a conversation with. So you're then moving into a much bigger organisation where you're managing a little bit more through the layers, and you don't see the senior people as often as you might have. And how do you adapt to that and understand? So I think, and equally from a county point of view, we were used to, we would obviously interact with our teams and we would be visible, but nowhere near as much as in the districts, because you just didn't have that time or space to do all of that. So adapting that to lead teams whose expectations are something different, both sides I think need preparation and time and understanding and probably development to understand how that works and how you can be a
Yeah.
leader in that environment.
While also doing all of the extra work that comes with the disaggregation and aggregation and so on. Let's talk about that work. I mean, everybody's talking about safe and legal on day one. It's clearly a very important sort of baseline target of what's needed. But can you talk a little bit about what that means in practice. What evidence does a program board need? Where a dependency is likely to be missed? How do you actually know if you're on track for it?
I mean, the way that we did it in Cumbria, and I must say it's one of the best, the most successful things we did in terms of our SRO, John Metcalf, was really clear. We had a really effective day one board. We had all of the work streams broken down into sort of like deliverables, day one essentials. We were held to account for them on a sort of weekly, fortnightly, monthly basis, however that sort of reporting mechanism worked for each individual work stream. And it was just, it was, I don't like to use the word boring, but it was just methodical. We just went through them. So
Yeah,
we need an effective website for day one. The steps to get to an effective website are A, B, C, and D. We need to have done A and B by whatever date. Have you done it? If we've not done it, what's the mitigation? How we're going to work it through. So just really intense, detailed program management, and being really clear about all the deliverables and the mitigations that needed to be put in place. I think the other thing that you mentioned in terms of those interdependencies, I think that's one of the things that we underestimated at the start, but very clearly started to realize we needed to get a grip of. So particularly around ICT and the ICT interdependencies across all of the work streams, how they could facilitate, how they could make that happen, as well as running their own work stream. I had that to a smaller extent in digital. So digital was embedded across lots of different areas of the organization, for example, highways. Not only did we need to deliver our digital work stream, but we needed to facilitate highways so that they could deliver a product on day one. And I think
yeah.
the mantra that John had and we had was services that are at least as good, if possible, better on day one than we've currently got. So just working towards that. I mean, I think there is a lot of conversation now around, is there an opportunity for transformation? Is there an opportunity for transition? Is there an opportunity to adapt and move forward? And I think given there's a little bit more time in this process, there are some opportunities around that. And certainly there's some thinking to be done about, if not transformation on day one, what comes after day one.
Yeah.
One of the things that we probably could have done more of is having some people or having the work stream leads thinking about, what's my plan for the year one post vesting day, year two, year three, year four. How am I going to lay out how we get there? So I think the danger of safe and legal can be that you land
Yeah.
safe and legal, and then you start to think about all the things you need to do for a viable, effective, functioning organization. And you probably you certainly want to have done that thinking before vesting day, if possible.
Let's dig into that a bit more, because there's kind of two issues competing in a way, and I suppose they are transformation and integration, or the other word. So there's a challenge of sort of deciding what has to change before vesting day and what should wait. And that gets us into some of the hardest practical challenges where you're aggregating and disaggregating, doesn't it? But neither vesting day nor getting to maybe a slightly better council are the goal, are they? So, there's new problems that arrive on day two. There's a real move from what are inevitably going to be temporary transition arrangements to being a coherent operating organization, and so on. So can you talk a little bit more about, it must be a really strong emotional feeling, going from day -1 to day two, or day one, I suppose. How do you manage that transition across the day zero event horizon?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is to just have that clarity about what's coming next and where you're going next, and to as quickly as possible lay out a plan for your directorate or your team or your service area in terms of how that's going to work, and what the key milestones are and how you're going to deliver against them. I think the reason that I said about sort of pre-thinking is there are lots. So I'll give it a real example for us was,
Yeah.
lots of LGR, lots of organisations that have been through LGR then find themselves in a difficult financial position post vesting day. I think that was certainly true of us. One of the solutions to that can be rationalisation of assets in terms of capital receipts. We didn't do that thinking pre-vesting day, and it took us another 12 to 14 months to get ourselves to a position where we had a really viable pipeline of assets that we could potentially rationalise and could generate capital receipts. So there are things I think that you can do in advance of vesting day that don't involve people and 2P and structures that start to set yourself up as a viable organisation. I think the other part of it is, what are the, and this is from a program wide point of view rather than a work stream point of view, what are the 4 or 5 key things that we need to have thought through for this organisation to be financially viable for the first 12 to 18 months? I think that's really important. But otherwise you land with gaps, and then you're very quickly sort of scrambling around trying to find ways to fill those gaps, and you don't have a necessarily coherent strategic view of it. You've got a very operational, let's just get this done view of it, which I think helps.
And you're saying you, but of course you were one of the rare senior leaders who saw right through that transition. What obviously happens in this process is a lot of managers, leaders, and politicians leave and a new set come in. That brings in HR considerations and complexities about consultation and so on, politics in some sense of who's going to get the jobs and all the rest of it. Can you talk a little bit about that and how best to manage that? Are there principles, are there ways of thinking that actually help to deal with that reality that some people are leaving and new people are arriving in a quite a big change?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say is to be as clear as possible about the process for appointment and recruitment as you can be. Give people the right information at the right time. I don't feel we appointed our senior people early enough. So lots of the plans that were developed, and I think we had a really good operating model, but lots of the plans that were developed with a very small number of people that then were inherited by some senior leaders who were coming in who had to try to sort of make sense of it. So one of those things would have been that example I just given around assets. That was baked into the medium-term financial plan in terms of a way of closing the gap, but we didn't have people working on the actual things that were needed in order for that to happen. So I think get your senior sort of chief exec, stat officers, directors, ADs, or whatever an organisation calls that sort of level 3 in place as soon as possible, engaged, looking at member priorities, looking at the council plan, and starting to develop strategies and plans around how you're going to achieve that. I think the earlier you can do that, the better. I think the other part of it is, and again, there are lots of complicating factors, but how quickly can you get to a coherent structure across the organisation so that you've got people in really clearly defined roles, sort of pay and grading, etc., etc. Because what I experienced in my directorate was you had people from a district sitting next to people from a county doing a very, very similar job, but maybe it's on a very different pay scale. So that's culturally quite different as well. So thinking about your pay and grading structure and your restructure of the organisation and how all those layers and teams are going to fit together, I think is really important as well.
So very pleased with all of this experience that we got the potential of working with you, Simon, and we've been collaborating so far. It's been really helpful. What in a nutshell, or maybe a list, should councils facing LGR be doing now, and where can the Red Quadrant LGR Hub help?
I think very much thinking about the resource that you're going to need. I know we've said that earlier in the conversation, but there are lots of people now out there looking for resource, and making sure that you can get a resource that you can trust and you can really build a relationship, I think is so important. And I think the Red Quadrant Hub is so helpful because it has almost off-the-shelf elements that you can pick and choose and learn from other people and say, well, I need a bit of that and I need a bit of that. And there's been some thinking done around that, so I don't have to start from scratch, so I can tap into that. I think that is really, really beneficial. I think if we'd have had that, or certainly if I'd have had that when I was leading my work stream back at Cumbria, I think that would have been so beneficial, because if there's people out there doing the thinking and doing some of the work, and putting it out there and prepared to engage, then absolutely, tap into that because it's so valuable.
Great. Maybe broadening it a little bit from everything that you've learned in Cumbria and you're learning now with your live experience, what's the one thing that leaders should take more seriously? And maybe what's one positive opportunity they shouldn't waste?
I think and this is an obvious one, but I think communication and really honest communication. Nobody wants to give people bad news, but equally, don't say to your teams everything's going to stay the same and nothing's really going to be different, because that's not true. I know that's probably an obvious thing to say, but there is almost a human nature tendency to do that. Oh, it'll be all right. But I think explaining to people how things are going to be different and the opportunities, I think, is really important and also really empowering, because then people have the information to make the decisions that they need to make. I personally think that LGR is a fantastic opportunity for the sector, not because it's all of the problems, but it creates the opportunity to solve all of the problems, or solve some of the problems. So one of the things that we were able to do in Cumbria was move to be a prevention organisation, because we had housing, we had domestic abuse, we had revs and bends, we had customer, we had it all in one place, so we could bring those services together to become a prevention organisation. Couldn't really do that when you were two-tier. So
yeah,
I think sell the opportunity and be really honest about how it's going to look and how it's going to work. I think that would be my take.
Thank you very much, Simon. Pleasure working with you. And I hope if anybody has any questions, please feel free to follow up with me, Simon, or with Naseema Khan, our LGR lead. Thanks for your time.
No problem. Thanks. Take care.